We're talking still about this story of Lazarus, of this miracle that Jesus has performed. The weeks leading up to the actual miracle, we saw the preparation of it and the interactions that Jesus had with first his disciples, and then with Martha, and then with Mary, and leading up to the actual miracle. And then last week we saw the miracle of Lazarus. And so looking back over this story, some things that we continue to remind ourselves as we saw Jesus make the fifth I am statement that John records in his gospel. I am the resurrection and the life. And so we talked about that when he told that to Martha, that he's not just saying he has power to resurrect, but he is the source of that power. Not only is he the source, he is the avenue through which resurrection and life comes. That it is through belief in Jesus Christ that we will have that hope of eternal life, being resurrected on the last day and living forever. And what a powerful truth that was. We also saw that in this conversation, Martha made a powerful confession, and we acknowledge that confession was not her own. It came from a regenerated heart. She was a true believer, and this was the overflow, the outpouring of that faith that God has put in her by causing her to be born again, by birthing in her new life. And what a wonderful picture that was. And we saw Jesus after that weep. The shortest verse in the Bible, John 11:35, Jesus wept. And we discussed why he wept. It wasn't just sadness for Lazarus being dead because he knew he was going to raise him. It wasn't just because Mary was upset about it, but as he stood and saw all the Jews gathered around and how they wept and wailed and responded as the pagans who have no hope, the sin sickness of the world got to him and caused him to, as we looked at the Greek there, that silent outburst of weeping, that controlled weeping where he was overcome with grief, but yet still kept it in control as he wept silently. That is God's attitude toward sin and toward a sin-sick world, is it causes him anguish and pain. He feels the indignation every day for the sin of the world. But then moving on, last week we got to see the climax of this story in Lazarus being raised after 4 days in the tomb. Again, we talked about how the Jews didn't embalm their bodies. They prepared with perfume and spices, but there was no embalming process. And so as he was getting ready and said, let's remove the stone, Martha was a little concerned. It's been 4 days. There will be an odor by now. But Jesus knew that wasn't the case, because Jesus was bringing new life into the situation. And he called Lazarus, come forth. And then John very specifically says the man who had died came forth. That indicates to us that this was no imposter. This was no switcheroo, sleight of hand, illusion, gimmick. This was Lazarus, who had actually died, now came forth. And when he came out, he was still wrapped in all the cloths and everything. And so Jesus said, unbind him, let him go. And as they went and they unbound him, the face that they saw was the face that they buried, and saw that this is truly a miracle. God has resurrected someone who has been in the grave, in the tomb, for 4 days. On the scale of miracles from an earthly mindset, this was a big one. This was the greatest one they'd seen to this point. Having seen a variety of miracles, and of course John doesn't record everything that Jesus did. He didn't even record everything that the other Gospels recorded, but there were quite a number of miracles you can go back and look at. From turning water into wine to waves being calmed on the sea, to demons being cast out of people, to lame healed, to the blind healed, There was even some dead people resurrected, but after a day, after hours, not after 4 days. So that was significant to the people, and it affected them. And we talked about how that was going to bring some faith, strengthened faith to his disciples. They were going to see this, and it was going to embolden them to trust in God even more. And so we get to this week where we began there in verse 45, and we see that many of the Jews did believe, right? And so we continue to remind ourselves every time we see John refer to the crowd of people as Jews, we remind ourselves that means what? That these people were hostile towards Jesus. And so this was such a great miracle that even many of those hostile towards Jesus now believed because they saw what he did. What a wonderful testimony that those that were actively hostile to Jesus could not deny the power, could not deny the miracle, could not deny what had taken place, seeing a man dead for 4 days brought to life at the command of Jesus. It affected them. They could not deny his power, his authority. Okay, but as we have seen, anything that Jesus does, whether it's teaching or performing a miracle, what happens? Controversy. It causes controversy. We've seen it all throughout. Whether he's teaching about being the bread of life, whether he's doing something good and positive like healing a lame man. Oh, he did it on the Sabbath and so he's broken a law. Healing a blind man. Oh, he did it on the Sabbath. He's breaking a law. Whatever he does causes controversy. And it's no different here. As we read in verse 46, some of them went to the Pharisees. So what happens is some of those that saw the miracle were strengthened, but some of them went and alerted the Pharisees about what just happened. Because think about it. Think about it from an unbelieving mindset. Think about it from someone who is against Jesus, who is hostile to Jesus, who doesn't want to believe that he's the Messiah, and he goes and he pulls off something like this. Uh-oh, we're in trouble. Because we've been against him this whole time, and what did he just do? That's significant. We need to go alert the leaders, right? We need to go alert the Pharisees and let them know. And it's interesting here that it specifically says they went to the Pharisees. And then the Pharisees and the chief priests gathered the council. Okay, we're going to see why that's significant here in just a couple of minutes. But here they are threatened by Jesus. Not that Jesus made a verbal threat, but they're threatened by his power. They're threatened by his authority. They're threatened by his abilities. And so they go warn the Pharisees. Okay? So we need to look at who we're dealing with here. So the chief priests, the Pharisees, and the council are the group that we're dealing with. Now, I did not put on the screen the background of the Pharisees because we've talked about that before, right? We remember that the Pharisees were formed after the Maccabean revolt, when several of some of the people, seeing how they have now won back Israel's national right and pride in that Maccabean revolt. They were nationalists who came together and they kind of made a commitment, a vow that we're never going to lose our identity as Israel again. Right? So we're going to be devoted to God and his standards. We're going to be devoted to our nation. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. And while it sounded like a good idea, the way they formed, good intentions, what it became was a group of people who were power hungry to keep the status quo. Okay, so that's who the Pharisees are. We've talked about that before. But who are the chief priests and the council? Well, first of all, the chief priest was a committee that was made up of former high priests and members of high priestly families. So these were people that were either in power as high priest at one time or in power as members of the family, because we know we're not naive to the fact that not the person in charge is not the only person in charge, right? We're not naive to the fact that family members can give advice and suggestions and things can be enacted on others' ideas because that person's in charge. We know that's how politics work. And so this committee is made up of former high priests, the high priest, and other people, members of the high priestly families that have been in power, right? They have influence. They have name recognition. This is who we're talking about when it says in verse 46, the high priest or the chief priest and the Pharisees gathered. This is who the chief priests are. It's this group of people. Okay? And so the Pharisees and the chief priests, these people that we're talking about, they gather the council. So who is the council? The council was the Sanhedrin, and we've talked about them before too, haven't we? But just to remind you, the Sanhedrin was the most powerful judicial body in Israel. They had a lot of the same powers as our government does. In legislation, they made laws. Many of the laws that they kept weren't God's laws. They were laws that they came up with. They judged who was guilty and who wasn't. And then they also executed judgment as well, what they were allowed to, because again, they're still under Rome. But they were the most powerful Jewish body. Okay? This is who we're talking about. Now, they were made up predominantly of Sadducees. Now, we're familiar with that, right? We're familiar with that name. The Sadducees are another group of religious leaders. And what is the primary difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees that most people are aware of in the Bible? The Pharisees believe in a resurrection. The Sadducees do not believe in a resurrection. Okay? And so because of that, the Sadducees and the Pharisees did not get along well, did they? They had a lot of conflict. But here's the thing to remember. We said it was significant that the people went and told the Pharisees. So the Sadducees had the power, being the most of the Sanhedrin. But the Pharisees, even though they were in the minority, they were the more vocal group of religious leaders in Israel. They're the ones that had the people's ear. They're the ones that had influence with the people. They championed themselves as the people's religious leaders, even though the Sadducees made up most of the council, which had the most power. And so these two groups, they had a lot of conflict. They didn't get along real well. But now here, because of what's happened, they come together to take care of this issue of Jesus. These two conflicting groups call a truce, in a sense, to deal with the problem of Jesus. Now, to put this in perspective, think about our political landscape today in America. Do the Democrats and the Republicans get along? No, they do not. It's not just they don't get along. They actively attack one another. And you can't. It doesn't matter which group you fall into. You cannot point the finger that the other attacks more. Both attack each viciously. How strange and significant would it be to us if we saw the Democrats and the Republicans lay down arms and come together to work on one problem to deal with somebody, wouldn't that be pretty big? Wouldn't that kind of affect everybody that saw that? These two groups working together? This is what we're dealing with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The fact that they are coming together to plan a strategy against Jesus when they are so in conflict with one another shows just how influential Jesus is, even to those who are hostile to him. They're going to do whatever it takes. They'll work with whoever they have to deal with this problem. Again, it gets back to, we've been looking this whole time at the Pharisees have looked to kill Jesus, right? We've seen numerous times in John's gospel where they were looking to kill him. He didn't go here because they were looking to kill him. And we've even seen them kind of lose their emotions and become enraged and attempt to stone him on the spot, right? They weren't doing it the right way. They would have been outlaw or doing it illegally if they had, but they were so overcome by anger that they attempted to, right? So we've seen this whole time there has been desires and thoughts and looking for opportunities to get rid of Jesus. But now now that this significant miracle has taken place, now that they've got a report that there was a guy who died, a guy that they probably knew, Lazarus, because we talked about the family being popular. That's why so many came. They not only probably knew him, they knew that he was dead. They knew this wasn't a gimmick thing, that he was actually dead. And after 4 days, Jesus has resurrected him. This is some serious power. This is some serious miracle. This is a serious situation that we're dealing with now. Because people are going to believe in him. People are going to acknowledge this. That's what they said. Look at verse 47. What are we to do? This man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. Everyone's going to believe if we don't do something here. And so they are so power hungry. They are so focused on maintaining the status quo that instead of acknowledging the truth about Jesus, the authority that he has, the power that he has, the signs that he have done that testify to him, instead of acknowledging the teaching and the way that they have not been able to trip him up, the way that he always teaches with authority and always overcomes their arguments and their attempts to trick him. Rather than acknowledging all of that, they were threatened by the possibility of losing their power and their influence. That's what they were worried about. That's what they were concerned with. That was their threat. And it even says in the rest of that verse that they were worried about the Romans. Because see, the Romans, they were the ruling authority. And they could do a couple of things that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the chief priests, the council would not like. The first thing they could do is they chose who was in power. They appointed leaders in Israel, governors and things like that. So they could, if they wanted to, you're out and I'll put somebody else in that'll be loyal to Rome. Right? So they were actually threatened to lose all their power with Rome coming in and say, yeah, you be in the council, not anymore. Yeah, you being all the religious leaders, nope, you're done. We're taking you out. So it was a personal threat to them, but it wasn't just a personal threat either. It was a national threat because Rome could come in and say, all these freedoms we've afforded you, all this life that we let you continue your traditions, we let you continue your feast and your celebrations, we let you live as you want to live as long as you continue to pay us tribute, all of that, because you've got this guy trying to come up and be a leader and everything, yeah, you're done now. You don't get all of those rights anymore. We're removing all your freedoms as a nation. This was the power that Rome had. This was what the Pharisees, the chief priest, and the council was worried with, is because of the power and influence of Jesus. If he continued, he was going to gain such a big following that he and Israel would be a threat in Rome's eyes, and they would take action. And so, if you're going to refuse to believe in Jesus, if you're one of those who had some power, whether it was the ear of the people or a place on the council that worked as the government, judicial and executive powers, if that's your position, then you very well are right to be threatened here. Right? They were legitimately concerned. This was not some fantasy threat that they've made up, right? And if you're not going to believe in Jesus, then that's probably some good steps to take. But the problem is, Jesus is not just some rebel leader trying to take political power, is he? Oh, as believers, we understand and we know we have access to the truth because of God's grace to us and in giving us the faith to believe that this is the Son of God we're talking about here. This is the Son of God that they are lowering their idea of. They don't look at him as the Son of God, as the Messiah. They look at him as a nuisance. They look at him as just someone to threaten their power and a political adversary. And so Caiaphas steps in. Caiaphas is the high priest that year. And he makes this really bold, really controversial statement, right? As they're sitting there discussing this, as they're worried about it, he kind of scolds them a little bit, doesn't he? You know nothing at all. You know nothing. He's basically saying, you're not thinking clearly. You're not handling this the right way. Here's what we need to do. It is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. That's what he said. Right? It's better for you. Now again, who's he talking to? The Pharisees and the council and the chief priests. The Pharisees, remember, they're nationalists. When they were formed, they said they're not going to lose the identity of Israel anymore, right? It's better for you that one man should die than the whole nation. In other words, it's for the greater good. Right? One man dying for the nation is the greater good. Right? Well, here's the thing. He's completely right, isn't he? In that statement, he's right. Is it better that one man die than a whole nation? Absolutely it is. Absolutely it is. However, he was completely earthly and temporarily minded when he spoke this truth. He did not understand the significance of what he was saying. Strategically, he's right on. He has hit the nail on the head. He is dead right. But he didn't understand what was actually happening. Because the high priest throughout Israel's history is who God has used to speak to his people, right? He's used prophets, and he's used the high priest to commune with the people. Right? Who was it that went through the process of the temple or tabernacle into the Holy of Holies to commune with God's glory? It was the high priest, and only the high priest did he have that relationship. And so even though now the high priest position is not what it used to be, because before Jesus arrived on the scene, we had 400 years of silence, right? Where God did not speak to his people. So it's not the same position as it used to be, but because of the history, because of the tradition, God is now using the high priest to make this prophecy. And he doesn't even realize what he's prophesying. He didn't understand the weight attached to what he was actually saying. He did not realize that he was speaking of something spiritual and eternal. He thought they were just dealing with the problem of the day. So God used that office. It wasn't about the person. It wasn't about Caiaphas himself. It was the office he held that God used to make this prophecy and deal with the sacrificial death. And notice I put there for the elect. Why did I put that? Because it says here in John 11, verse 51, he did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who were scattered abroad. Jesus is dying for the elect that are spread out, not just geographically, but through time as well. Because we're still seeing people saved today that are God's children, that Jesus died for 2,000 years ago. So this was an intensely bold and powerful prophecy that Caiaphas has made in spite of himself, because of God. That's going to point straight to the sacrifice of Christ. And it's so significant that this is attached to what is considered Jesus' greatest earthly miracle in his ministry time. The death and resurrection of Lazarus. Because this whole time, as they have been confronting Jesus and trying to figure out exactly where he stands and who he is and is he legitimate, and the more that he does, the more they see, wait a minute, he may be legitimate. He continues to do things, continues to confound them, and even though it's not recorded in John's gospel, we can read through the other gospels and see that Jesus blatantly calls the Pharisees out, right? Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Right? You're like tombs, dead on the inside, even though you're painted on the outside. Woe to you, brood of vipers. He's not pulled punches with them. So it started with them just trying to feel him out, to getting a little threatened by him, to being rebuked by him, and getting enraged and wanting to do something, to this now is the final straw. This miracle of Lazarus is what got them to work with the Sadducees, to work with the council, to come together and say, we have got to do something. And the high priest, because of God, prophesies it's better for one man to die than the whole nation. That's what has led us to this point. And so, we know previously that the Jews had been seeking opportunity to kill them, right? We know that they had been looking for chances and trying to figure out and try to trap him. But when it says in verse 53, so from that day on, they made plans to put him to death, it means that they now actively sought to arrest him. It means now that their minds were made up. Their course of action was set and determined now. There was no more discussion about whether they should. It was a done deal. They knew he had to die now. And so because of this, we also know that him being arrested and being put on trial was a formality. They had already made the decision. They had already judged him guilty here. He was already judged guilty by them at this point. And so moving forward, nothing was going to change that. That's why when we see Pilate try and say, I find nothing wrong with him, they're not listening. It's not an actual trial to them. The trial's already happened. The judgment's already been made, and here it is. It's at this point where they are determined now, he's got to die. It's done. He's got to die. There's no turning back from this decision that they make. And so because of that, because this is now what it's come to, Jesus, he can't walk openly anymore. Now, we talked about how at the end of chapter 10, he kind of separated himself after they sought to stone him, and it was the end of his public ministry, and he's been kind of in seclusion now, just teaching his disciples and those who follow him, and he only came now because of Lazarus, and Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were people that Jesus loved, and coming out now to raise him. And the Jews that were there, he wasn't going to a public place to do this. They had come down to grieve with Mary and Martha. And so this wasn't a public ministry display so much as it was they just happened to be there. But now that's not even the case. Now he's not even just going to walk openly anymore. He's got to be careful. Now he's going off to Ephraim with his disciples because it's kind of a wilderness area. It's several miles outside of Jerusalem, further than Bethany. I think the atlas said, or the Bible atlas said that it was about 12 miles northeast of Jerusalem is where he was going to be staying. And so Jesus, being man but also being God, he knows that they've decided to kill him now. He knows the plans. He knows what he's walking toward, but he also knows that he's not going to be caught and killed before time. Right? So he's not walking openly because it's not time yet. It's not time for all of this to take place yet. He's still got a week. Right? So actually, it's going to be a little bit more than a week. We know the Passover's at hand, but it's about a week before the Passover, and this will be the last Passover, right? Because it says the Passover's at hand, and this is the third and final Passover that John records in his gospel. This is the Passover that Jesus is tried and crucified. So we're a week out of Jesus' death, and we're only in ending chapter 11 and chapter 12. So chapters 12 through 20 will deal with, will be all about Jesus, 21, actually, his death and resurrection. So here he is. He dies at the end of chapter 19. That's when he's crucified. So chapters 12 through 18 are all in a week's time. It all happens in a week. Here we've gone through 1 through 11, and we've gone through 3 years of Jesus' ministry in 11 chapters. Well, now these last few chapters are much more condensed time frame, 1 week. And so it says in verse 55, we know leading up now the Passover's at hand, that a lot of people went up to purify themselves prior to the Passover. This was what they did. And, well, Jesus did that as well. And they knew in the past that Jesus was faithful to follow all the rites of purification leading up to the Passover. And this is what's causing people to question whether or not he's going to show up. You know, it says they were looking for Jesus, saying, what do you think, that he's not going to come to the feast at all? Based on who he is, based on what he's taught, based on his habits, he's going to come. He always has. He's still going to come. They're looking for him. And so why were they looking for him? they expected him to come, but the chief priests and the Pharisees had put the word out. They had put the word out to look for Jesus. When it says they'd given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know. What that is most likely referring to is they had informants all throughout Jerusalem. They had informants all throughout, so when they saw him, they were to report back so that they could arrest, try, and kill him. And so what we're going to see is, even though all those informants there, even though it's all planned there, and he does, we're going to see him come into Jerusalem in the next chapter. In verse 12, we're going to see him come in the triumphal entry. A lot of people are going to see him come in, right? And it's still going to be a week before they can get him. All because God has a timeline, and His sovereignty cannot be overthrown. So that's going to end chapter 11. A really significant chapter at that, when we see the level of miracle that He performed. We see the confession that's made. We see what's happened to Jesus' opposers after this, and this is going to lead us into the last week of Jesus' life on this earth. So it's been really eye-opening to me, some of the study that we've seen. I hope it has been to you as well. But as we continue to go through chapter 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19, leading up to the crucifixion of Jesus, we're going to see Jesus doing some serious teaching here in the next few chapters about who He is, about the Holy Spirit, about God the Father. So hopefully you'll continue to follow along with me, and it'll be a blessing. Let's pray.